Hey, what's going on, you guys? My name is Very Useful Engine, and today I'm going to give you guys my thoughts on the 2.3 alpha. Now you may be thinking, didn't Psyche just do the same thing? And the answer is yeah, he did. I've been meaning to make this video for a while, but he kind of beat me to it, because as I was trying out the alpha and making the thumbnail for this video, I saw that he just posted that. So, no intent to steal anyone's content, of course. If you haven't subbed to him already, which you probably have, then go ahead and do that, because he makes really good stuff. So, for my thoughts on 2.3, I'll just go down a list of the patch notes, talk about the major things like weapons mutations, balance changes, and then a couple of bug fixes that I think are really good as well. I won't include absolutely everything, but I'll try and cover everything I think is significant to the game overall, and say how I feel about it. But I'll just go ahead and say right now, overall, I think 2.3 is really good. It fixed a lot of problems that super duper slow weapons have. It added 3 new super duper slow weapons, which are not all very good, but they're all at least fun for the most part. And I'll get into that a bit more later on. But what you're seeing right here is my first time ever using the big axe, so don't roast me too hard. It's really hard to use and I had never even done it before. So first up, I guess let's talk about the changes to the difficulty of the game. And I think they're really good just because the game before kind of jumped around a lot in difficulty, with 2BC being like way harder than 1BC, and 4BC being way harder than 3BC. But I think the changes to this makes it go a bit more linearly in terms of just the difficulty curve overall, instead of just jumping around like crazy. So I think that's a pretty good change, and 5BC is just going to be as hard to clear as before, but getting there is not necessarily easier, it just is a much more linear path and won't take as much grinding per BC to get through it. So if you're wondering what those changes look like, for 0BC there's health fountains in every transition, 1BC there's health fountains in every other transition. So 0 and 1BC are the exact same as before. In 2BC, unlike before where you only had a couple of health pot refills on the entire run, there is now one in every single transition. So 2BC is going to be a significantly smaller jump from 1BC than it was before, which was like really when the difficulty of this game started getting crazy, is when you jump from 1 to 2BC, because 2BC is just a lot harder. Or it was anyways, but now they seem to have fixed that a little bit. And for 3BC, there's now 1 minor flask after the first boss and before the second, so 3BC is pretty much what 2BC used to be. And 4BC does not have any more malaise, but there's no health in any transition, and enemies still teleport, so it's like a slightly harder version of what 3BC used to be. So overall, I think the difficulty goes on a much more linear path than what it used to, because 4BC and 5BC used to be pretty much the same thing, and 2BC was way harder than 1BC, but that's not really the case anymore. I think it doesn't jump around nearly as much, so that's a pretty good change for sure. Now the next change listed in the patch notes is that there's now an intern to the collector that shows up on 5BC and will allow you to pay for blueprints. Now, this doesn't make any sense lore-wise, but this game's lore is kind of already a huge mess, and what's really nice about it is that now when you're on 5BC you can actually pay for outfits, because when you were on the lower BCs you would always be spending your money trying to unlock weapons and skills, and that way you never really paid for outfits, and then by the point you hit 5BC you almost had every weapon, but you don't really have a way to buy the outfits without going back to a different BC, and no one really wanted to go back to a different BC just to unlock outfits. So now that the little intern is there, it's actually much easier to try and just get all the outfits in the game, and it gives you a reason to want to without having to go back super far in the game. And yeah, I think it's a really good change. It may not make sense, but it was well deserved and needed, so I'm glad they did it. Now next up for the weapons, the first one you're seeing me use right here is the big axe, and if we're being honest here, I don't think it's very good, because while it does do really good damage in breach, it's just really slow. Like, to the point where you can't attack anything more than one enemy who isn't, like, frozen. On top of that, the combo being super slow, but just barely not doing enough breach to keep all enemies stunned makes it really difficult to use, because even sometimes after hitting an enemy you'll have to run away from them and then try and get back in with that super slow combo. So the only real combination I've been able to find that works well with it is either ice shards or ice bow, but that can be said about pretty much any survival weapon, and you're not really getting any benefit out of using the big axe when you could be using like the broadsword, for example, which is just the same thing but with much better range, even better speed honestly, and it works better in boss fights. It doesn't have the movement. It gets outclassed by pretty much all the other super slow survival weapons because not only do they all have much better range than the big axe, but the big axe makes those weapons seem fast with just how ungodly slow it is. Now it could be pretty good, but I think they just need to increase the range a little bit and increase the breach to the point where as soon as you hit an enemy they'll have no chance of escaping the combo, because if they do, it takes super long to kill them because you have to actually get back in on an enemy and you have to continue the super duper slow combo. It does good damage, but I don't think it's worth it to use, especially when options like Broadsword and Scytheclaw are out there. Now on the contrary, Big Club is definitely worth using. Now I do think it does kind of struggle in bosses because you can't use the charge shot without like breaking it, but in biomes, if you do a half charge it releases instantly, and if you do a full charge it will pretty much one shot anything. So if you combine it with like ice shards or frost blast and something like that, you can really get a lot of mileage out of it. Now I heard from somewhere that apparently you're not supposed to be able to instantly release it when you do a half charge, but they haven't patched that out yet if it is a glitch, and for the time being I think that the Big Club is a really good weapon, especially in biomes, because the ability to just slow down an enemy super quick and then have the attack come out instantly and one-shot them is really good. And you can even one-shot like elites, for instance, just by getting the charge shot off, and if you use something like a crusher or an ice grenade then you can do that pretty easily. It definitely does struggle in bosses, but that could be said about pretty much any survival weapon that isn't giant killer, so I still think it's a really good weapon. And lastly is Tombstone. Now the old version of Tombstone was kind of just really generic because you could never really get the tomb to do anything, but they have changed it in 2.3.2 onwards, and they made it so that as soon as you get a Tombstone down you can wipe off every single enemy on the screen just by destroying it, which I haven't tried for myself yet, but I've heard people say is really good, and I definitely have reason to believe them, just because putting a Tombstone down and then killing everything on the screen and creating more Tombstones seems like you could just be able to create a chain and wipe out entire biomes of enemies. I'm definitely going to be trying that out shortly here, but I wanted to make this video first, so I'll be giving you guys an update on that at some point in a future video. Now next up are the 3 mutations added, and first up is No Mercy, which can be really good with certain builds. Now it's not the best with like slow heavy survival builds because most of the time you're not going to be getting an enemy down to 15% before they just die, but with some builds like this one for instance, where I have the dual bind, enemies are going to be hitting 15% but not dying all the time, and the same thing goes for like a lot of tactics builds where you're just holding down a weapon to try and kill something or doing damage over time especially. That's my main point, was like damage over time with Frostbite mutation, Alchemic Carbine, stuff like that. As soon as an enemy hits 15% of their health, they're just gonna die. And on top of that, it even works on bosses, so like, you only have to do a fraction of the boss, and then as soon as they die, you don't have to worry about it anymore, which can save you from being hit, as especially the hardest parts of a boss fight are usually at the end, and it can make you worry about it a lot less as you're going through it. So, for those reasons, I think No Mercy doesn't work super well with every build, but with the right one, it can be extremely good. As you're seeing right here, almost every enemy I'm seeing is just getting executed, and they're not even getting to live out their full life, they're just getting hit and dying. So when the goal of your build is just to chip away at an enemy's health, like this one here for instance, Impaler damage over time builds, it's just gonna make the game a lot easier than it was before. Now next up is Barb Tips, which I also think is a really cool and pretty good mutation with the right build. So for those of you who don't know, Barb Tips does damage over time based on how many arrows you have stuck in an enemy. Now this works really well with the No Mercy mutation because it's damage over time. It also works very well with Hokuto's bow, and it works very well with the ammo mutation so that you can get as many arrows stuck in an enemy as possible and get a ton of damage over time. I think it's a really unique and cool mutation because it allows you to basically turn any old tactics weapon into a damage over time one, and I think that's really nice. Lastly is Point Blank, which I haven't tried out yet, but it's a close range attack inflicts a set amount of bonus damage. I'm not sure what that is, but I imagine this would be very good for using with stuff like the heavy crossbow or the infantry bow. Now, one thing I would say about it is that I really wish it also worked on melee weapons because it's way more mutations and tactics that work with ranged weapons, despite the fact that there's still a lot of melee weapons that you can get working in tactics. So I don't think there's any reason that it shouldn't work with melee weapons, since there's not many mutations in tactics already that benefit melee weapons, but either way, I think it could be a very interesting mutation. They also added an Omnivorous Diet, which just switches up the food randomly as you find it in the world, and I think that's really cool because it was something you could do with outfits for a while, where you could just have a random outfit, but you could never have randomized food. You were just stuck either having the same food all the time or switching in between them in the menu. So now you can just have an Omnivorous Diet and it will pop up at random depending on which food it generates. So yeah, I think that's actually really cool. Now for balance changes, I won't spend as long on these because there's just a few. First up, the Tesla Coil blueprint drop rate was increased. The reason they did this was because you have to get the Tesla Coil from the living barrels, which you pretty much can't use a Hunter's Grenade on. So instead of just having to go through the distillery over and over to try and get the Tesla Coil blueprint, you can just do it once or twice and get it with the new drop rate. So that's a really nice change. Just makes it easier to get, and now more people will be able to actually use it. Items obtained by the collector when completing a blueprint are now colorless. This is a really good change in my opinion, because if you see something and you want to buy it from the collector but you're on like a tactics build and it's a red item for instance, you can actually just pick it up anyways and then use it on your build just to try it out once you buy it from the collector, and I just think that's a really nice change. Now here's a really big one, which is that malaise no longer increases the movement speed of enemies. That was one of the big problems with the malaise system, was that it completely screwed up your muscle memory, and it made using slow weapons really hard to use because you employ a slow playstyle of course, but then that leads to enemies becoming faster and the weapon just becoming perpetually harder and harder to use. But now that that's out of the game, you won't have to worry about that anymore, and I think that's a really good change for slow survival weapons to be more viable. The sudden death prevention, which is what happens when you're above I think 26% HP and an attack would have one-shot you normally, but it sends you to 1 HP instead of just straight up killing you. The invulnerability you get from that has been increased from 0.5 seconds to 0.6, so not a big change there, but still nice to have, I guess. And then lastly, it says all weapons now have a bit of air control if an enemy is in the strike zone. Now, to be honest with you, I have no idea what the strike zone is, but I'm guessing air control is like where you can kind of float in the air while you're attacking with a weapon. So if that's a thing on all weapons, that could be really interesting, but don't quote me on that because I'm not really sure what that means, and I'll have to verify that at some point. And then in this kind of patch as a whole, they fixed a ton of the problems that the Fatal Falls DLC had. And starting off, they capped the Fractured Shrine's damage to 15% of your max life, which is really nice because if you went in there without Masochist before, it felt like you were kind of screwed, but now you don't need to take it because that's just 10 as opposed to 15. So it's kind of like a built-in Masochist mutation where if you're getting hit in the Fractured Shrines, it's not the complete end of the world by any means. So yeah, I think that makes the biome a lot more accessible and less punishing compared to other options in that exact same time frame. They also fixed the scroll count issues that the Fatal Falls DLC had, so there's bonus scrolls in Fractured Shrines in 3BC and onwards, and in Undying Shores in 4BC and onwards to make them on par with the other levels in that time frame. And for Fractured Shrines, they also turned one of the double scrolls into a triple scroll. They also changed up the aiming of the soul shot from the lantern a little bit, which is nice because before it would kind of like really hard lock onto whatever the first enemy was in front of you and would ignore whatever that was behind it. But now if this patch note is correct, then it should target both of those at the same time to try and pierce them. So that's a pretty nice change there to the lantern. That will make it a lot better in biomes. They also made it so that you can now find one outfit and one other item in blueprints. So if you find a weapon but you're going for outfits or vice versa, you won't get that one blueprint spot per biome taken up just by something you didn't want now, which is a really good change because that way you can get multiple things at once and not just have that spot taken up by something you didn't actually want. Now another huge change to malaise that's going to make slow weapons much better is that mobs can no longer spawn or turn into elites due to malaise in the first few seconds after an elite mob aggroes you. Now that's really good because with slower weapons, it takes longer to kill elites, obviously, and when you are in an elite fight, enemies could just spawn on you, turn into elites, then you're fighting multiple elites which spawn more enemies, and it could just turn into a huge mess, increase your malaise a lot every single time you had to fight an elite. But now that that shouldn't really be a thing anymore, it's a much nicer thing for slower weapons in general. The last balance change they made is that Shovel, Flashing Fans, and War Spear now work with Porcupine. So shovel and flashing fans will deflect bombs, flashing fans will give you some crits after you deflect bombs, and war spear will just penetrate multiple enemies and do crits. So that's pretty nice overall. I think shovel and flashing fans could definitely be pretty good with the Porky-Pack mutation, just as like a fake armadillo pack that'll do a little bit of damage for you. But I don't see war spear really being that good, just because rolling and attacking multiple enemies at once wouldn't be as good as just having something else in Porky-Pack. Now for level design, both of these were listed in the balancing changes, but they just fixed a couple of missing scrolls in the Fatal Falls DLC, and they made the Fatal Zones and the Fractured Shrines more tolerant. Now I'm not going to go over the graphics and UI changes because most of them are very small, and if you want to look at them yourself, I'll leave a link to the patch notes below. The biggest one, I guess, is that Cocoon now says parry when you parry stuff, so it's now satisfying to use, which is really nice. So for quality of life, there's just a couple big ones. Cursed gems now require a long press to be picked up, no more accidental cursing. So why this is really nice is because I've actually had a couple runs where I accidentally picked up a cursed gem, and I cleared most of them, but I distinctly remember one time where I accidentally picked one up that was like right next to a teleporter, and then died on the curse. So that's actually a really good change now, is that they're not going to have it. Also, I just completely missed that challenge drift. Anyways, hold to chain attacks has now been added into the options menu, which will basically mean you can do the combo of any particular weapon just by holding down the button, which is really nice because sometimes it felt annoying to just have to spam click, but it also has some potential with dual binding because you see stuff like quick bow, which already exists where you can hold the button down, and that has some pretty good dual binding potential because you can just throw something out once and then continue attacking, and now you can do that with any weapon just by enabling that in the options. So that could work really well with, like, you know, Boy's Axe and Nutcracker, stuff like that, where you couldn't do that before, but now you can, so that's actually really cool. And lastly, Hunter's Grenade now respawns on a platform after being thrown into the void. The first time I went to Fractured Shrines, I accidentally threw it into a void and then lost my potential to get a blueprint, so I'm glad they did that so no one else has to go through that because I kind of just wasted a run. Yeah, that's actually another really good change. Lastly, bug fixes. There's a lot of them, so if you want to see them all, once again I'd recommend you go check out the patch notes for yourself. But the biggest ones I'd say, they fixed the Serenade bug where you could reset your cooldown and the one where it ate your main weapon, so those are really nice. Cocoon now gets its cooldown back by parrying bombs. Cocoon always allowed you to parry bombs, but if you did that you wouldn't actually get the cooldown back, but now you're able to do that and not worry about losing the cooldown forever, which is a pretty big buff to Cocoon, I would say. And lastly, they fixed Porky-Pack not working after the first enemy hit. So I used to think this was just a cooldown, but it turns out it was actually a bug that it wouldn't hit enemies. So if you roll through two enemies with like an oiled sword for instance, then they're both going to get that oil on them, so that's a really big buff to Porky-Pack as well. So overall, really good stuff coming out in Update 2.3. And if you made it this far in the video, please do consider subscribing and liking, it helps me a lot. And with that out of the way, I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see y'all later.